Hi, I'm James French, and this is my video interview for my out-of-state application for Seattle University MIT program. So the first part was one of my strengths, and I would have to say that would be my ability to understand people's backgrounds and where they're coming from. Growing up in the school that I went to, I knew a lot of people from all sorts of walks of life. I knew people who struggle to make ends meet, living paycheck to paycheck. So I have that experience with people who just aren't really well off, and so they were some of my best friends. And I also had really good friends who had plenty of money, had amazing big houses, and so I've known people just up and down the wealth spectrum, and so a lot of diverse situations there, and so I've gotten to know and understand where a lot of different people are coming from, and that's definitely a strength that I have. And one of my weaknesses would be that I can get kind of stubborn sometimes with my own ideas. A lot of times if I come up with an idea, I usually think it's the best idea, and I don't often listen to what other people have to say before committing to what I've thought up as the best idea. And so that can sort of be a challenge. And sometimes when I try to, a way that I try to overcome that is by letting other people speak before I speak. That way I can listen to what other people have to say before jumping in and just saying, well, I thought of this, so it's probably the best idea. And so the second part was discussing the factors in the increased gap of in racial groups and education performance on standardized testing and such, and why after all the legislation that we've had in the last decade and a half, those historic gaps have actually been widening instead of narrowing. And so I have my friends here, Rena and Conchetta, and we're going to discuss that. So yeah, I definitely think a lot of it has to do with history and the fact that after Plessy versus Ferguson, when the court said that separate but equal was equal, the reality was that it wasn't, and the white schools were really good and got all the good funding, while the schools for the black kids clearly were not equal. They were really bad. And so from the get-go, you had this you had this problem where one racial group had really good schooling and another didn't. And I think that has trickled down through the decades and just led to some of the problems we have today.
Yeah, I agree. I think also a big factor in especially standardized tests today in schools is that we have a lot of immigrants who come to America, especially now, considering what's going on in the world. And I think that the standardized tests are really catering towards a standard group of people in America, and I don't think that they include the immigrants, because if someone's coming from another country, even if they do speak English, they might not recognize cultural norms and things that might be on tests, especially in reading, stories, folklore and things like that. So I think it makes comprehension of those subjects even harder for them.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just a language barrier, I think it also has to do with culture too.
Yeah, the prompt had said specifically reading scores were not doing well, and that's definitely a factor. If you don't know English well and you're presented with a Mark Twain novel or something, a little snippet to read, it's going to be really hard to read that.
And I think that especially with all the legislation that we've had, that some schools are just kind of stuck in their ways, and especially schools that get less funding. Even if they get a little bit more funding, maybe the teachers have just given up on half of their students, or the students themselves have been well, I'm not going anywhere in life, so why try on these tests? And I think that kind of mentality that might be in schools that get less funding is the reason why, despite all the legislation, that those schools aren't doing as well as the schools that get more funding and have better teachers and better resources and motivation to do so.
Yeah, and definitely with all the standardized state tests, the schools that do better on those tests get more funding, so obviously their scores are gonna keep getting better and better over the years, and the schools that didn't do well usually get less less funding, and so their scores continue to drop. And yeah, I think what I said earlier, that connects to history, because it's, from the beginning there was unequal schools, and so if you have these tests and say, well, the good schools get more money and the bad schools don't get as much money, well then from the get-go this racial barrier has been a problem.
Yeah, and I wonder if another problem might be the fact that teachers spend a lot of time in their classroom preparing for these kinds of standardized tests. I know in my field placement currently, I'm in an 8th grade class, and they're doing DBQs, like document-based questions, and so they are doing something that they've already learned, but they're going over it so much because the teachers need to have passing grades. So I think that takes away from regular learning, so students don't have as much opportunity to learn those things, even if they are, in different racial groups or anything like that. So I think that's another thing that really takes away from learning.
Yeah, and because when you teach for the test, you only are able to emphasize certain kinds of skills, a very specific skill group. When certain students, they may not do well in that, but they flourish in other kinds of ways. And definitely, just between the different, ethnicities, there's so many different cultures. One might emphasize a certain kind of learning this way, whereas, other cultures emphasize learning, in a different kind of way, but that never gets picked up on standardized testing, where it's just reading, writing, and math. If that's all you ever know about someone, you have no idea how good they are in, other kinds of circumstances.
Right.
And I think especially because there's, we know that there are different types of learners, that if you're a learner, someone who learns better by physically doing what you're doing, or touching things, and a test, no matter how well you might learn the material, the test can't, you might not be able to translate that into a test. So even though you're smart, your test scores don't reflect that.
Right.
And if that's for different types of learners, all throughout one school, then even though those kids are smart, even if they are getting less funding, but they're good kids and they're smart kids, their test scores won't reflect that, because their test scores aren't reflecting how smart they are.
Yeah, it's if the SATs existed, in the Renaissance for Michelangelo, I have no idea how he would have done on them, but he was known as a painter and a sculptor and an architect.
Yeah.
If he did poorly in reading and writing, he could have been deemed, you're not a smart kid, you don't know what you're doing, and then that passion that he had for a different kind of activity in life may not have been able to have, because he thought, then I guess I'm worthless, I don't really have anything. But because this shows that some people don't fit into that mold of reading, writing, and math. They might be really great craftsmen, architects, carpenters, auto mechanics, things like that.
Yeah, and I think that really that brings up a new idea for me. So these standardized tests a lot of them are to get students to go to college, and I think four-year colleges are great, and they work for a lot of people. But I don't think that they work for everyone, and I think that if students are forced to go in that path of taking the standardized test and being good at this, and let's say they're not good at it and they are good at maybe a craft like auto mechanic or something, they don't get trained, or they don't get the encouragement to go and pursue that idea, and then they end up going to college and wasting so much money and time on something that they might not have been good at. And I think standardized tests are really making people feel that they need to go to college, they need to do what everybody else in society is doing. I think it's really taking away from other kinds of jobs.
Yeah, we all knew, we had a friend here, Nick Esposito. He dropped out last year because he wasn't doing well, but that really wasn't his thing. In his free time, he was an amazing artist, a great metal worker, woodworker, but in the structure that we have here at the school, there wasn't really an outlet for him to pursue that, and sort of, he ended up dropping out just because he was struggling with, the schoolwork that he had, and, he didn't really have any opportunity to do what he wanted to do, really, and actually uses his talents.
Yeah, and I think that, especially once you get to college, if you did, really well on math, on the standardized test, but you're good at math, but let's say you like to paint instead, and you go into a major, that is math related simply because you're good at it, but it might not be what you actually want to do. And so then you have a bunch of people that are, you know, like they graduate and they're getting jobs and like things that they were good at, but not necessarily things that they want.
Right.
And so then are they really, like, they aren't really happy because, like, well, I'm good at math, so I did business. And, like, business is okay, but I much rather would be painting, or I much
Yeah.
rather would be a farmer, and things like that.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like stifling of creativity that comes in with it, and then you have people stuck in jobs that they hate, and 50 years down the road they're like wishing they had done something else. So I just think standardized testing is something we should maybe think about getting rid of.
Yeah, that definitely is. Trying to relate it back to the main focus of the racial groups. Yeah, I think with the different cultures, some cultures just do better with a certain kind of standard in testing, but others have different ways of learning.
Well, and I wonder also if it might be better to change, like maybe not get rid of standardized testing, but change them so that other racial groups can feel that they are more accepted. Now I don't know if that would be like incorporating a certain test for like whatever racial group, because that would be, I think, too much to do, but maybe putting more generalized, instead of doing like a reading on an English author or an American author like Mark Twain, who has specific, like, you have to know your background in the American South in that time, then maybe instead of something like that, you just do a standard reading that doesn't have anything to do with anyone's history or culture, so that people can show those skills without having to recall things from a culture that they're not familiar with. I think that might be a better way of going about it.
Have less objective questions, more subjective, where you can just sort of get into and show who you are and your specific way of expressing yourself. Right. Getting away from, like, based on this selection, if you have no experience in that selection, you're not going to do well. Even you might be a great reader if you just don't know that thing specifically. So you could change questions so that it doesn't focus primarily on one racial group's background.
Right.
Because when we do talk about reading in school, it's usually like old American or English authors, and it's it's all the like English European culture. I didn't even read like an African book until my senior year of high school. All we had read before was European-based literature. And so if you come from Africa, like Rena, you're not gonna have as much background in that. So it's just going to be a lot harder, even though you could be really smart, like Rena.
Yeah, and I think also another thing that you could use, like, do to improve them is maybe having the test translated into the languages
the native language,
the native languages, so that people who are immigrants might be able to demonstrate skills better if they are reading it in their native language instead of a second language like English. So I think that might, because they do that for special ed children.
Yeah.
So I think, like, it's something to think about with standardized testing.
Well, anyone have any final thoughts? I think we've hit our time limit about right now.
Yeah.
All right, that's good. Okay, well, thank you for your consideration, and have a good day.